you. My name is Tina Graven. I come from the National Center for Grief in Denmark. I would be very interested, well, first of all, thank you very much for very enlightening presentations. I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts as to whether the bereavement diagnosis, which is underway through the classification system, would actually be a leverage, would have the potential to be a leverage for mental health in a global context and in a development context.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Hello, Caroline Krause from the Anna Freud Center. My question concerns the role of psychology and the psychology literature in informing these debates. Alison mentioned the American Psychiatric Association, but apart from her, I don't think anybody has referenced psychological literature. So my question is there possibly a disconnect with psychology being traditionally more interested in the global north, and that's where most of the evidence comes from, and not maybe so much in dialogue with what happens in development and in the global south?
Thank you.
My name's Jane McCarthy from the Open University. I wanted to put a really, really general question to the whole panel, because we've been talking about expectations and norms, and the focus today is on young people and children. I wondered whether it is particular expectations and what might regard as idealisations about childhood that themselves can sometimes be a cause of problems, because it raises expectations and amongst children themselves as much as anyone else. And in that context, when children do encounter troubles and difficulties, then is that part of where the stigma comes from and the sense of difference and loneliness?
Okay, thank you. Should we begin with these three questions? Does anyone have any responses to them?
I can very just quick responses. I think the issue you raise about the literature on psychology, I think you're spot on. I think probably, I'm coming to this as an anthropologist, and I probably have not read the psychology literature, and I think it's probably because it doesn't necessarily apply to the global south. So I agree. I think you're spot on, and I think from my perspective, I would very much like to work with psychologists further on this and see how we can sort of weave in some of that work and apply it and sort of how we adapt it to cultural context. Obviously, there is sort of cross cultural psychiatry and these types of areas, and I'm becoming more and more fascinated in that, and I think I do agree that we probably need to look at that more. Just in response, a very quick response to your question, this idealization of childhood. I suppose I'm not sure if I've got a response to it, but I was just doing some field work in the Terai in Nepal, not on psychosocial mental health, but we were talking to very young children, around 10 to 12. This is a longitudinal study we're doing on adolescents, starting with children very young, 10 to 12, and following through their lives. And what really surprised me about some of these children was their maturity, actually, and their ability to discuss and topics which I would have thought children in this context, but then I'm not sure, would not be able to deal with these sort of topics. So on the one hand, I was very impressed. On the other hand, I was thinking, are we putting too much burden on these children? And I suppose, it gets me to thinking a bit about what you're saying. Obviously, the context is so different that we're talking about, and maybe these children have had to take on more responsibilities than a child today in this sort of context, perhaps. But I'm not sure. But I'm sort of, I think your question is great, and I'm not really answering it, but I'm just musing about some of the findings that from my recent field work.
I'll stop there. Thanks. Richard, would you like to respond to it?
Yeah, I really can't answer that question. I think it's a really good point, and I'd be interested to read more about how you kind of the issue around expectations, I guess. Psychology. So I guess from what I know and from a differ's perspective, it's two the issue around mental health has too often come from a medical perspective, and rather than a kind of social perspective, and trying to understand the social dynamics. And therefore, I guess we're trying to, and enjoying the presentation, trying to kind of level the playing field, so it's a holistic. So we look at both. So if we do look into generating more evidence around it, then we need to look at all of the issues. So I would imagine that anything new that we do would look at both perspectives.
Thanks for the questions. Yes, I would echo what Richard said, really, about the kind of medical approach, and so our study we're particularly trying to take a more sociological, kind of anthropological approach to understanding bereavement, so that we're not sort of just drawing on models which have been developed in the global north, and we're actually looking at the kind of experiences of the families that we meet, and emphasising the social in that. In terms of the question about expectations of young people, I mean, I think often that ideals of childhood are often why young people are seen as dependents, and people don't recognise their caring roles within the family, and and the everyday realities of the majority of young people's lives around the world. So I think, sometimes there is a disconnect again between the programmes, which may be defined as support for orphans, and the kind of how young people see themselves and their lives.
Thanks. I'll just put the a few external audience questions to the panel before we come back to the audience in the room, which connect quite strongly, I think, to some of what's already been raised. So the first is a question from Christina, who's from Tear Fund in India, and she'd like to ask Richard, the Washington Guide doesn't cover mental health or psychosocial disability within its disability categorisation. Are there any other guides that do cover psychosocial or mental health as a disability? And then there's a question from Madhya Ansari from Cities for Children in the UK and Pakistan. And she has a question for Fiona. She says, we found that the concept of PTSD is manifested and dealt with differently in different cultures. Are there examples of culturally appropriate adaptations of a response? Then we have Leah Gogulu Webb from Networked Planet US. And she asked, does the panel have any resource suggestions for those working with struggling refugee groups in informal camps around Turkey? And then lastly, Jane, who's a psychologist in the UK, asks, how does the panel feel it can address the danger of imposing Western approaches or diagnostic categories in other cultural contexts, which I think we've perhaps touched on that already. But, so, Richard, there was a question.
Yeah, so it's completely right. On the Washington Group questions, it doesn't explicitly ask anything on mental health, but they would argue, the Washington Group would argue, that it is covered in the questions. So perhaps maybe not psychosocial well-being, but mental health is covered through the types of questions that are asked around, how you function and your ability to to do certain things, and it's picked up, but it's not explicitly mentioned, which is a criticism of the Washington Group questions. But there's an extended set that are sometimes used, which does cover mental health. So the Washington Group questions are 6 questions. It is pretty basic. But in terms of psychosocial disabilities or well-being, there's no international agreement on data collection. So I guess I'd throw that question back and ask for advice, and what are the questions we should be asking? What are the questions that donors should be working together to get international agreement on? Because I don't know.
Thank you. Fiona.
Thanks for the question. I would love to hear more about the studies or findings that I can't remember her name, in terms of the different kinds of manifestations and sort of responses to PTSD. I can't really respond to PTSD particularly, but I think one of the big the issue that we've been grappling with is with exactly what you raise, is like, how do we make culturally appropriate sort of responses? And I was just, again, thinking of this work we've just finished in Vietnam, and what I was going to say was a very culturally sort of particular response. It may not be, in fact, and it would be good to hear from actually the work in the UK, whether this actually is a response. So there, many people spoke about the sort of disconnect between the generations, between the parents' generations and the children's generations, as being a really huge driver of mental health and psychosocial ill-being. That was a real, a lot of people spoke about it, and a very specific response that people wanted and suggested was to do some do training in parenting skills amongst parents. They felt that was critical, in order to somehow bridge this gap, which created a whole lot of sort of, led to, to addictive behaviour, online addictive behaviour, girls committing suicide, etc., etc. This disconnect between the generations was really big in Vietnam, and parenting skills was a critical response to that. So I suppose I can't particularly answer your question on PTSD in particular, but I do think that we need to think about culturally appropriate responses.
Alison, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I'm just happy to pick up a bit about that kind of that disconnect between generations, and I think that has been one of the ways that services for bereaved children and young people here in the UK has looked at trying to support communication within families, particularly when my expertise is in the area of grief and bereavement in families, but when there are quite different understandings within the family about the appropriate way to show emotion, or to share feelings, or to talk about what's happened. And some of those disconnects are generational, but some of them are gendered as well, and there are other kind of aspects of difference within families, which can themselves then be a source of additional difficulty because people aren't meeting expectations, or there are different understandings about how people should grieve within the family, and that in itself becomes a source of difficulty. So I think quite a lot of the work that particularly happens with families around grief and bereavement in the UK would be about trying to kind of manage some of those differences. And I guess that's why there's a particular emphasis on work with whole families where possible, because individual counselling approaches with children and young people maybe aren't then able to take account in always of the kind of the wider family context, which actually is where children are living out the majority of their lives.
Thanks. Ruth?
Yeah, just to come back to the question about resources for working with groups. I mean, I think some of the ways that we've all been talking about don't necessarily need to involve a lot of resources. It could be, if it's about developing peer mentoring, it could be raising awareness within local communities about, the different types of emotions children may be experiencing, etc. All of these things don't necessarily need a lot of resource sort of input.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience in here? Yes.
Thank you. So my name is Karen. I work for Save the Children Denmark. And my question relates to how we talk about global south and global north. And looking at some of the demographical movements going on today, looking at lots of people being on the move, many times those being young people. And those movements also, of course, brings about new social dynamics to take into account that affects their mental health and psychosocial well-being. I guess my question then is, can we keep on talking about the global north and the global south the way we've done it so far, or what do we need to do in order to create policies or practices that actually takes those dynamics into account, or those new social dynamics into account that impacts the well-being of young people?
I just have a question for Richard. It seems from what you're saying that there is some sort of increased recognition within DFID that, that mental health and psychosocial support needs some more attention, and there is enormous need that's not particularly being addressed, and there isn't specific funding for it, etc. And I guess my question is for you, at the moment where DFID's thinking is at, how do we as various partners sort of walk the journey, and what do you think is needed to sort of for the next step to happen, if you like, for there to be increased action or the traction that's needed to really push it forward to, and you talk about the evidence gap, but I think there's sort of more than just sort of waiting for the evidence to come out. And I just want to know your thoughts, how right now, I think there is some increased momentum. How do we, walk with DFID and actually pushing that momentum forward?
Should we take one more question? Yes.
Brian Pratt, is that working? Brian Pratt, editor of Development and Practice and advisor to AD, amongst other organisations. What worries me is I've heard a lot about people developing problems, psychosocial problems, whatever you want to call them, but I've not heard much about dealing with causes. I've been working recently a review of a very marginal area of Lima, northern Lima, with children with extreme problems. Children who are so neglected, so abused, both sexually and violence, that they've not learnt to speak, even when they've got well into sort of grade school. I know some of the solutions to this are relatively simple, childcare and so on. Others are extremely complex. We're looking at a series. This year I've worked in Lima, Delhi, and Dhaka in Bangladesh, totally dysfunctional cities, where in the case of Lima, children are left alone. Mothers leave home at 4 or 5 in the morning to go off to work. There are often no fathers anyway, and return 10 o'clock at night. These kids are locked in the house. The reason they don't speak is because they've never learnt to speak. They're not listening to people speak. I mean, there's all sorts of other things. I've just used that one example. And I'm not hearing people talking about how do you get back to the cause, rather than dealing with the problem once you then discover you've got a child at school who can't speak, or a child who is totally sort of pathological in their behaviour.
Okay, great. Some really interesting questions there. So should we start with Ruth this time?
Okay. So to go back to Karen, your question about the global north-south, these terms we all know are problematic, and we've kind of I don't know whether majority world, minority world is maybe another way of phrasing it that perhaps takes account of the fact that the majority of the population are in the global south, but again it sets up a binary between the two. I think in terms of policy and practice, I think there is now more openness to dialogue between practitioners in the global north and the global south, and that was one of the aims of today, that we wanted to bring people together to share expertise. As you say, there is increasing need for whatever expertise. I'm thinking of a colleague at Reading who is a sociolinguist who's been working, hasn't worked particularly in the global south before, but he's been working in the Middle East, looking at language for resilience in refugee camps. So I think there is an increased kind of interest and openness perhaps to working across these boundaries. Yeah.
Just building from that, I think some of the studies of sort of international migration are sort of bringing these two sort of, so-called dichotomies together somehow. And I think, hearing some of the interesting studies about, Afghan migrants in the UK, for instance, and how the sort of psychosocial mental health difficulties they're facing, and it's interesting to hear that, it's a lot of it is based on expectations back home, how they're supposed to behave, and, they're supposed to remittance or whatever, things like that. But at the same time, there's sort of, they're within a society like the UK where expectations are very different and ways of being are very different. So in a way, yes, I think these dichotomies are sort of dissolving together, and I think, just building on what Ruth says. In terms of your comment, I think in terms of the causes, I completely agree of mental health and psychosocial well-being, and I think in a way what I was trying to do was sort of set out the various drivers, which have, various drivers which are very much sort of overlapping and intertwined and sort of layered, which leads to this sort of psychosocial and mental health. And a key one is issues around poverty and is issues around sort of, transitional, processes. And I think that's why, in a way, the responses need to be, to say the same thing again, but very multi-sectoral. And I think the economic is critical, as we've also heard.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll answer the question on specific to DFID. So I guess what I'd first say is that you're completely right. I think there's a big recognition that we haven't, there hasn't been a priority, but I think it's really good news actually at the moment that it will be a priority. Sorry, not necessarily just mental health, but disability as a whole, with mental health included in that. The 3rd of December, International Day of People with Disabilities, is an important day where we can kind of set out some of that level of ambition. In terms of how you can help us, I guess, or how we can work together, I think, if the evidence is out there, and we're not using it, or there's real proven interventions on what works, then I think if you could send that to us, that'd be great. I guess it's important also to work with different teams in DFID. We're siloed, we work together, but we're siloed as teams, but we also work together. Do send stuff around kind of disability to us, around mental health to us, about kind of proven interventions, I guess. The health team are kind of trying to work out at the moment how mental health fits in with their broader work on system strengthening. So again, if you have stuff around that, that'd be great. But what our plan was to kind of take a bit of a two-staged approach to it, was over the next couple of years we really need to get the data, we really need to get the evidence, and then we can kind of scale up to 2030, and that's the plan. And then there are a number of conversations happening on mental health at the moment. So I'd just really encourage you to just, it'd be good to talk and to hear about the evidence already that exists. It's normally not, within DFID, it's normally not a case of people aren't interested. It's actually more of a case of you don't have the time and you need to prioritise. But therefore, if you can help us and health colleagues make that job easier by going, well, this actually works in this context, we've got the evidence, that'd be great.
Thank you. Lynette, would you like to respond to any of the questions? No? Okay. No problem. Or Alison?
I guess just the point again about the global north and global south. I would hope that the opportunities to learn and reflect wouldn't only be sparked by huge numbers of people on the move. I would have hoped that would have started to happen already. I was quite surprised fairly recently to be asked to write an annotated bibliography on childhood bereavement, and then to realise that somebody else had been asked to write one in the same series on orphanhood. And actually it would probably have been more sensible if we'd both been asked to get together and write something together, because I think there is a real problem with literatures not really talking to one another, and I think that's a symptom of programmes not necessarily talking to one another, when actually there is a huge amount that could be, I think, beneficial universally if there was more conversation and exchange.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you to everybody for joining us here at ODI this morning. We hope that you've found the session stimulating. Please make sure that you pick up some publications from our panellists, which are on display in the foyer. There will be a video recording of this event that will be made available over the coming days. And I'd particularly like to thank all of our panellists and discussants, and especially to Lynette for joining us from South Africa. For those guests who are staying for the rest of the day, there are refreshments in the lobby, and we'll reconvene in this room at 11:45. Thank you.